Good afternoon, and welcome to this panel discussion about the unrest in Kazakhstan and its implications for broader developments in Central Asia and in relations between the West and Russia. I'm George Beebe. I'm Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest, and I'm pleased to have with me today two very prominent experts from the United States and Russia in both Central Asia and the greater US-Russian relationship. Alexander Cooley is the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College. He is also director of the prestigious Harriman Institute at Columbia University. Fyodor Lukyanov is probably Russia's most prominent foreign affairs expert. He is the director of research at the Valdai Discussion Club. He's editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs, and he is chairman of the Presidium of Russia's Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. Events have moved very quickly in Kazakhstan over the course of the last week or so. They began with what looked to be spontaneous protests over rising fuel prices in Kazakhstan. They very quickly transformed into more violent and apparently more organized protests, and quickly led to a request from the president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, for the Collective Security Treaty Organization, led by Russia, to send peacekeeping troops into Kazakhstan to help restore stability. The latest developments today indicate that Tokayev has said that the mission has been accomplished and that it was time for those CSTO forces to begin moving back home. So I'd like to begin by asking our panelists to talk a little bit about how they understand what has happened here and why. Let's begin with Alexander Cooley. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, George. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you and of course with Fyodor. Look, there are still some things that are murky, but I'm viewing this as the result of kind of three interrelated dynamics. One is a set of protests, as you mentioned, that started in the west of the country against plans to liberalize the price of fuel. The symbolism of the 10-year anniversary of Zhanaozen and the government's previous crackdown on oil workers there, of course, played in heavily to this. The protests then spread to other Kazakh cities, including the largest, Almaty. So there we have, grievances against, the government, its governance, perceptions of pocket lining and corruption. The second element, though, is a power struggle within the country itself between President Tokayev and the former ruling family and allies of former President Nazarbayev, including the arrest of the security chief, Karim Asimov, who was arrested on charges of treason. And there we see the possibility that some of the protests were, in fact, fueled by instigators who were placed within these places to sort of pump up the violence and create a pretext, possibly for an internal political move. So we have this inter-elite competition turned violent. And then the third dimension, I'm sure Fyodor will address more, is this regional dimension, and especially the very quick turn to the CSTO and Moscow, and the quick decision to support Tokayev. In contrast with what happened in Kyrgyzstan 10 years ago, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh, not only was the CSTO mobilized for the first time in its history, but it was done so, I would argue, quite efficiently and quite rapidly.
Fyodor, how do things look from Moscow's point of view?
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody, and thank you for such a timely event, very efficiently organized, almost as efficiently as CSTO reacted to call from Kazakhstan. So in general, I have not so much to add to what Alex just said, because obviously there are different kind of reasons for what happened. Certainly, socioeconomic situation in Kazakhstan has been deteriorating since quite a while, and Kazakhstan has been affected quite seriously by COVID pandemics, as all countries, but there it had to do with the interrelation with some accumulated socioeconomic problems, certainly. And those who deal with Kazakhstan, they remember a series of unrests, not that big as now, but quite significant unrests with with different background, but it demonstrated since several years that the real situation is not that excellent. Kazakh leadership, especially President Nazarbayev, when he was in charge, and his team, they used to be very skillful in creating extremely beautiful facade of Kazakhstan, which has been seen by many, including by many in Russia, as a very successful statehood, which probably was a little bit exaggerated, as we see. Secondly, I absolutely agree, this is uncompleted transition, a transition which had to become an example maybe for many countries, probably even for Russia, but now we see that it didn't work very well. And at the end of the day, I don't believe that President or former President Nazarbayev himself was interested in something like prolongation of this transition, but certainly in his entourage and in his family, at least some members of his team believed that this transition should be corrected, and the leader whom Nazarbayev picked up should not be the final choice, so to say. And yes, indeed, it was a regional dimension which had to do with the Russian perception of what can happen in Kazakhstan in case of collapse of the existing system there. And as you saw last week, first day or first 2 days of turmoil, that was a very bad feeling. And it was a feeling that this system, this regime can really be overthrown by somebody, and no one could clearly understand by whom. So this quick reaction, yes, indeed, I agree that it demonstrated surprising capacity of CSTO. I don't believe that many people even here expected that this organization, which has been viewed for many years, if not decades, as just a decoration, as a Russian Vanity Fair, so to say, to have a something like NATO, but in fact it worked. Obviously, the real capacity is not in Armenia or Kyrgyzstan, but use of CSTO was extremely important as a tool to legitimize this operation. And maybe even more important for Kazakh leadership, because for them and for the population there and for the nationalist forces in Kazakhstan, it would be more difficult to accept just Russian help, Russian support. And here it looked like a collective security measure, which, as we heard today, will be ended soon. What I would stress as a very new development, and I think Alex mentioned that CSTO did not act in this way before 2010, when then President Bakiyev was overthrown in Kyrgyzstan. The interim government, interim President Otunbayev called for help, but at that time CSTO rejected this bid, partially because Otunbayev had no legitimacy, but also because it was a decision, right decision, I think, to interpret what happened there as an internal affair. And if so, then CSTO has nothing to do with this. But this time, I think it's a very important milestone, not just for Kazakhstan, but for the whole post-Soviet area. And this is to a certain extent reflection of general trends, which we see worldwide. Any turmoil is seen as not entirely domestic anymore. So maybe we will learn more about this outside interference, which has been mentioned by Kazakh leadership and all other leaders these days. And certainly it was something, because partially the infiltration of radical Islamists in southern part of Kazakhstan has been discussed among specialists since quite a while. But the most important thing is that in the current international environment, the line between domestic and internal and external has almost disappeared. And any instability can be seen both as a result of some outside factors and an outside factor to other countries. So, of course, for Russia and for other CSTO members, especially neighbors of Kazakhstan, the biggest fear was that collapse of this regime might generate a spillover to other countries. So I think it's very important that we should expect that this domestic element, which bared from the CSTO and many other actors from operating, now is disappearing. And that's quite funny and quite ironic that national sovereignty in 1990s, for example, or 2000s has been eliminated by certain countries under umbrella and under slogan of violation of human rights. And that was a liberal motivation for this interaction with sovereignty. Now we see exactly the opposite motivation with basically the same result.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, I think there's a couple of really important points to stress here, right? One is certainly here in the US and in other parts of the West, the CSTO was regarded as a talk shop. It was, you know, dismissed. It was mocked even as trying to mimic NATO. Oh, it has a rapid reaction force. Oh, it has peacekeepers. But when it comes down to it, it doesn't intervene. It doesn't do anything, right? It's a virtual organization. We've seen this term used analytically. Part of the reason, I agree with Fyodor, there was a general reluctance to become embroiled in Kyrgyzstan. Let's also remember Karimov in 2010 was seriously contemplating his own military intervention into the south. And so for Russia to have activated the CSTO peacekeepers and just become embroiled in this ethnic conflict would have been extremely messy in terms of it navigating its relationship with Uzbekistan, which at the time it wanted to stay in the CSTO, and Kyrgyzstan. And the same with Nagorno-Karabakh. Pashinyan appealed to the CSTO, but it was doubtful that the Kremlin was going to intervene on behalf of one of the belligerent parties. This is a different kind of conflict, right? This is unrest. This is aiding a regime. I agree that the kind of mysterious external forces frame this in a kind of color revolutions, undetermined external interference. That's an acceptable framework, both practically and normatively, right, for this to have happened. So in some ways, you know, we had to reach the right kind of situation to see the mechanism activated. The second thing is, I think this is an example of regional ordering happening, right? We've talked a lot in abstract theoretical terms about maybe, you know, the decline of the liberal international order and the institutions that were put in place by the US and its allies. And we saw this on display in the fallout from Afghanistan. And I wrote about kind of, you know, a post-American world. Well, this is a good example of this going on in Central Asia, right? Where it's not only that Russia accepted Tokayev's framing, right? The 20,000 instigators are somehow all kind of foreign elements and agreed to sort of support him. But China as well talked about the importance of the government preserving domestic order, talked about the problems of the three evils, and reiterated that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, kind of China's preferred regional security integration mechanism, would also back this. So we see different types of order being applied with different regional organizations supporting different kinds of norms. And from my position, they are illiberal norms, but they are regional norms, right? And so I think the implications of this goes really beyond the Kazakh-Russian relationship. It has to do with whose rule sets, whose kind of law, whose justifications spread in a particular region or govern in a particular region.
We have a question in from Paul Starobin. He asks about what's going on in the area of clan warfare in Kazakhstan. He has sources that indicate that this is really a battle between Tokayev's crew and the Nazarbayev family and their allies. Is that an accurate framework for understanding what's happening here? And he further asks, could this lead to some sort of redistribution of property among the elites in Kazakhstan, and what might be the implications of that?
I'll take a quick stab at it, and then maybe Fyodor can weigh in with some examples from Russia or other parts of the world as phrased in the question. But my own understanding is that there's an internal dimension to this, but there's also a hidden external dimension. And internally, sure, the Nazarbayev family, its allies, have effectively controlled most of the lucrative income-generating assets in the country over the last 3 decades, whether it's oil and gas and the energy sector, whether it's banking. The Sovereign Wealth Fund used to be operated by the former president's son-in-law. So, there's no accident that members of the Nazarbayev family are also on the Forbes billionaire list, right? Let's be candid about this. So, a move onto these assets, as we've seen in other Central Asian countries when there are power transitions, as we saw on the move, for instance, on the aluminum smelting plant in Tajikistan when Rahman came into power. This is part and parcel of what power brings. Power brings potential access to assets and income generations. The problem is going to be that many of these assets have international connections and property guarantees, and they are embedded in a much larger order of property rights, sort of stock listings, international arbitration agreements, and so forth. So it's going to be difficult if there is indeed this interclan infighting for the Tokayev allies to just wrest control away from the Nazarbayevs. And the Nazarbayevs have built up quite a global network of property holdings and assets and controlling stakes and shell companies. And just one example, and a little bit of shameless self-promotion here, me and some colleagues, we had a report for Chatham House a few weeks ago on London and the UK as a center of sort of post-Soviet oligarchs. And our research found there are about 330 million pounds worth of luxury real estate holdings of Kazakhs. 2/3 of those are affiliated or members of the Nazarbayev family, right? So that's just sort of what we uncovered. So for sure, with power comes access to wealth. The question is, where are these power struggles going to be fought over? Because it's not as simple as just taking over a mine or taking over a power plant.
Fyodor, if you wouldn't mind commenting, it looks to me like the Russians have made a conscious decision to side with a particular faction in this battle internally. Is it because the Russians think that Nazarbayev's period is ending and that there needs to be some other basis for stability in Kazakhstan?
I wouldn't interpret what happened as Russian siding with one faction, because Russia sided with the official authorities. So Nazarbayev declared that he has left, transition officially has been completed. And I think I'm not qualified to talk about particular interests and this clan warfare. I think Alexander is absolutely right, but I cannot add much. But I think, of course, we know that corruption is an embedded characteristic of all countries which emerged on the territory of the Soviet Union. So it's no surprise to anybody. The question is about scale. And I think what happens now in Kazakhstan, this is a litmus test to the ruling group, be it Tokayev's people, Nazarbayev's people, or who else, whether they whether they are fit to serve interests of the state, not only interests of groups or this redistribution motives. And in this regard, I'm afraid that if they continue, if they launch and continue this redistribution and fight for power, they will lose actually the substance. They will lose the state, because all those states, post-Soviet states, the so-called, what was the formula 30 years ago, new independent states, all of them are facing now a very important test, not just Central Asia, but all of them basically, whether they have succeeded to build up a viable and sustainable statehoods. And we see how problematic it might be. Take a look at Armenia, look at Moldova, look at Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, which, as I mentioned, had a very carefully established facade, in fact, is very fragile and very problematic. And if this ruling group cannot understand that at this particular moment, they should stop this infighting in order to secure the statehood and the sovereignty of the state, then it will be end up very badly, also in terms of their personal selfish interests.
So we have two related questions here that I'm going to pose to you as a pair. One of them is from Anton Fedyashin of American University, who says Kazakhstan had prided itself on a multi-vector foreign policy. Has the CSTO intervention affected the balance between Russian and Chinese influence within Kazakhstan? And what do you think the implications of these events might have on Kazakh-American relations? Paul Hare of the Center for the National Interests has a related question, not from Kazakhstan toward Russia and China, but between Beijing and Moscow. He says, are there potential fault lines between Beijing and Moscow moving forward? Will Beijing be wholly comfortable with a stronger Russian hand in Almaty? And does this reflect a security versus economic division of labor in Central Asia between China and Russia? Who wants to start on that?
I mean, I can speak a little bit about multi-vectorism. Look, I think all of the Central Asian states, their preference would be to pursue a multi-vector foreign policy, right? And I sort of, I wrote about this in Great Games Local Rules. The period of, 2001 to 2012 was this kind of golden era of multi-vectorism. All the Central Asian states were trying to do this, managing relations among Russia, China, and the West. But what was the structural precondition that allowed for multi-vectorism in the knots in Central Asia? Let's be candid about it. It was Afghanistan, and it was US military and security cooperation with the Central Asian states. It was military bases, logistic agreements, security assistance, right? That's structural power. That's the basis then to allow for other things like engagement with international financial organizations in the West, or guarantees of sort of debt write-off, whatever it is that these states sought from the West. Absent US security cooperation, multi-vectorism becomes more aspirational. Sure, Kazakhstan trades with the European Union more still than anyone else. in part because of its oil and gas sales. But this kind of, this desire to be multi-vector just doesn't match up with where we are regionally, geopolitically at the moment, which is post-2014. Russia has deepened its involvement, especially after Crimea and the Ukraine crisis. And also China with the Belt and Road has deepened its engagement and its various sort of instruments, both formal and informal in the region. And the US has both retrenched, and there's a perception that it has retrenched. So multi-vectorism is great in principle, but what's that third leg going to be, right? What's that third pillar aside from Moscow and Beijing? It's not at all clear. As to sort of China and Russia, look, on this, I'm of the opinion that, if we're looking for areas where there's going to be daylight between Beijing and Moscow, we always thought it would be Central Asia, but I actually think it's the opposite. Central Asia shows how the two are coexisting. They have different priorities. They mostly don't impede on one another. China's very much interested in its border and Xinjiang and the north-south axis. Russia is interested in preserving the security and kind of normative and economic architecture before the two can coexist. And, I think there used to be a kind of a political economic distinction, maybe not so more now. You see China engaged in many more security activities than it was 5 years ago, kind of a couple of facilities in Tajikistan, lots of private security organizations, also intelligence sharing. And I'll just point out, a lot of Kazakhs use WeChat, right? And that was, a mobilizing, type of vehicle. I'm sure that data has been shared with Kazakh security authorities, and I'm sure Russia was perfectly fine. So I'm not going to say that Beijing and Moscow are aligned on everything. They're countries with different interests. But if we're looking for Central Asia and Kazakhstan to be the wedge between them, I think we're really looking in the wrong place.
I can just add that multi-vectorism is a very beautiful concept in a peaceful time. When it comes to crisis situations, to problems inside countries, they need to not just to choose, but they need those partners who can act and who can guarantee something. And in this regard, Russia demonstrated, again, to some surprise to many people, that it can act very quickly and very efficiently. So in this regard, I think, of course, this development and those events will have impact on Kazakh future geopolitical orientation. And if not, if Kazakhstan, after a while, will try to be back to this classical multi-vectorism of 2000s, for example, I don't think that it will be that easy, because of course Russia is not interested to see a revival and the renaissance of this kind of policy. As for Russia-China, I absolutely agree. I don't see any reasons for those two countries to clash over Kazakhstan or Central Asia at large. China increased a little bit its engagement in local security, regional security, but it's still very marginal and very tiny. So China is interested in stability when it comes to preserve Chinese economic interest in those countries. But China is not interested to get involved in all those problems there. And if Russia is ready to do it, as it happened now, fine. China is absolutely fine with that. As I know, the relationship between Kazakhstan and China has been deteriorating since quite a while. Since mid last decade, in Kazakhstan, there were several rounds of anti-Chinese explosions, both sentiments and even some unrests. And Chinese, as we know, they don't like this at all, and they used to punish countries which openly demonstrate anti-Chinese feelings. And the economic relationship between China and Kazakhstan is not on the rise now. It's rather the opposite. China is becoming much less engaged, which is a problem for Kazakhstan as well. So I think that it might be dynamics between China and particular countries, but it has nothing to do with whether those countries cooperate or interact with Russia or not. And in general, I think Alex is absolutely right that there is a question not only about rules and norms, but there is a question about capacities. Because the period when countries could sell and buy beautiful words and intentions and values as an asset seemed to be over, and now it's much harder environment when a real ability to act and even more frequently to act in practical terms with military force or something similar. That's what this is the new currency. This is the new. This is what is being demanded in many places. And in this regard, for example, those who are far away, like United States, or those who are trying still to operate with soft power means like European Union, they have much less chances in the region than, for example, Russia or some other neighbors with ambitions and capacity.
We have a question in from Jacob Heilbrunn, editor of the National Interest. Some American experts have almost welcomed the Russian intervention in Kazakhstan in the belief that this would tie Russia up, that it could bog down, that it would restrict Russia's freedom of maneuver in Ukraine. He asked, what does the speedy resolution of the Kazakh crisis imply for Putin's hand in Ukraine? Thoughts on this?
Maybe I start here. Of course, we cannot separate completely what happens in Kazakhstan and around Ukraine, but at the same time, I'd rather would suggest that this move will strengthen Russian position, because Russia demonstrated high level of efficiency and reminded everybody that in this area, the post-Soviet area, Russia still has much more leverage than anybody else. And I think at the end of the day, Ukraine is not a big exemption here. All those claims that Russia might be tied up by Kazakhstan, come on, the number of people involved in this operation is above 3,000 persons, including those from Belarus, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. I don't believe that all of them will stay there. I can imagine that some Russian personnel or maybe even military base will remain there on bilateral basis, but still it is not what can seriously influence Russian ability somewhere else. So I don't believe we can expect this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, I'll point to a couple of things to look out for. One is, as Fyodor mentioned, will there be some sort of residual force that is left, some sort of symbolic base, a voluntary CSTO facility? Just a reminder, we have CSTO facilities in Tajikistan and in Kyrgyzstan. We did not have one in Kazakhstan before. We had some bilateral leasing arrangements for missile defense testing site and also for Baikonur, the Cosmodrome, but those were bilateral. So that's one thing to look out for. But I do think the speed at which this happens, this gets to, Mark Katz has a question in the chat, maybe I'll link into here, that, did Tokayev need to do this in terms of his capacity in practical matter? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not, but the symbolism of it was incredibly important. more than the numbers. It's not that the Russian troops actually, or the other CSTO troops put down unrest. They secured assets like the Almaty airport, and they were a visible presence. It's rather they signaled support for authority and government authorities, and the signal went to any security services that might have been wavering, right, or might have been with Masimov or some other groups that Russia sees the government as the legitimate source of sort of state order, and in that, that was sort of quite important. So I think the fear might have been, well, is Russia going to be bogged down? Does Tokayev risk framing himself as having given away Kazakh sovereignty, right? Nazarbayev was always this big guarantor of Kazakh sovereignty, multi-vectorism, different multiple pipelines, close relations with Russia, but an open door. And he almost made this into a brand industry, right? Stability and sort of Kazakhstan's foreign policy goal. But I think Tokayev has avoided that. If indeed Russian forces very publicly get out within days now, then this kind of framing that somehow this undermined Kazakh sovereignty, while it might be true in the long term, that's not what the optics are going to be. So I think it's actually also in the Kremlin's interest to get this over with much public fanfare. And if there are quid pro quos that are going to be demanded, have them be actually quite private and behind the scenes, because the optics are trending in both, I think, President Putin's and President Tokayev's direction.
If I may add, just I think one very important element which Alex mentioned, to stress it, the importance of this intervention was exactly to send signal that Russia and CSTO, but primarily Russia, is behind this regime. And this is continuation of what happened to 2020 in Belarus without intervention, because at that time, it was no need for intervention. It was enough that President Putin just said publicly, warned that there is a force prepared, which will be used in case our friends in Minsk will need it. And that was enough. That was enough for those security forces in Belarus, and that was enough for Lukashenko. Here, since the situation was really bad, and I guess that people in Moscow were afraid that power structures in Kazakhstan can collapse, they did send people, physically send people. But again, it was not to fight insurgency. That was just to demonstrate that we will not allow any kind of regime change there. And again, we see that it was enough. And I think it's a very important changing moment in the whole area.
So I think the Belarus analogy is really important from a practical perspective regarding Ukraine as well, right? So since that threatened intervention and political intervention, you've seen Lukashenko adopt Moscow's line on Ukraine, right? Essentially going from balancing between the two positions, it's the Minsk agreements, right, to very openly citing and adopting Russia's framing on the issue. And it'll be interesting to see if Tokayev feels compelled to do the same. Whether he goes from a policy of wanting to stay out of this, right? A reminder, all the Central Asian states in 2014 wanted nothing to do with this in terms of taking sides, right? Some of them even missed the UN vote on Crimea. They neither sort of abstained, they just didn't vote, right? But it'll be interesting to see if he in fact comes out with quite a pro-Russian line on the need for, say, security guarantees or some sort of agreement in place, as a result of this.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that comment, Alex, because I think it's an important one. It wasn't all that long ago that Belarus was attempting quite consciously to maneuver between East and West, between Moscow and the United States, to maximize its own flexibility and leverage. Armenia did much the same thing. Have we reached a point now where many of the countries in the Collective Security Treaty Organization don't seem to think they have as much room for maneuver, and they are quite consciously tilting more in Moscow's direction than they were before?
I mean, I think Fyodor's answer that crisis and conflict changes your calculus is pretty much on the money, right? My own personal view is I adopt less of a state interest lens and more a regime survival lens to this part of the world, right? So what is in the interest of a particular regime to maintain power and survive? Sometimes that can be balancing the West and Russia, but sometimes it can be bandwagoning and siding with the side that is going to guarantee you, not impose pesky human rights conditions, not complain about the media crackdowns that you've come down on. And you're seeing this, quite clearly happening as a result of conflict. And Armenia was defeated militarily, right? I mean, that's the context it's operating under. So, I think you can't underestimate, regime threats as being, and that calculus as being, the number one sort of concern regarding kind of geopolitical alignment and the enthusiasm in which you embrace things like, balancing or, multi-vectorism or, fealty to different, Russian security and regional architectures.
I think any successful policy increases attractiveness of the actor, be it support of democracy, which leads to regime transformation. So democratic regime, like say the West, the Europeans and Americans did, or support of autocracy to help it to address public unrest or whatever successfully. That means that yes, we can.
I have a question from Keith Darden of American University. He asked, can we see this as a way to bolster the significance of the CSTO on the map as an organization? The organization had previously been looked at as not a particularly powerful organization, one that was a talk shop, Alex, as you had put it earlier. Is it now something that we could conceivably see as a legitimate peacekeeping organization in a situation such as, for example, Ukraine, where various parties have mooted the possibility of inserting peacekeeping forces in some way as part of a resolution of that conflict there? Could the CSTO conceivably play that kind of role in Ukraine?
From my point of view, certainly not, because to be a more or less successful peacekeeper, you have to be accepted by both sides. So Ukraine, of course, rightly or wrongly, I would say, will never see CSTO as something neutral, so no way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think that, probably the most damaging thing the CSTO could do now is overextend itself, right? Or involve itself in, much more controversial and more complicated external missions. So, in this particular case, I think if I'm in the Secretariat, I take the apparent victory and I sort of think about next steps and not embroil yourself in what's going on.
But maybe we can. It's any historical parallels are wrong, but if we remember Europe in first half of 19th century and the Holy Alliance between those who want, those leaders, those monarchs who wants to preserve stability and to suppress revolutionary mood, maybe this might be a mission for CSTO, but of course in the area of those countries, not broader.
I mean, one other footnote I would add is that of the early 90s. We had, not CSTO, but we had CIS peacekeepers in the quote unquote near abroad conflicts. And, a lot of people don't like to be reminded of this, but the UNAMIG mission right? The UN authorized mission with the US supported, and NATO countries supported in Georgia, for instance, in 1993 and 1994, coordinated with CIS peacekeepers. And one of the reasons the US agreed to that was that it was horse trading in the UN. It didn't think Georgia was important. So there was that international legitimacy that those CIS peacekeepers had. Now that changes, right? Over the course as we head into a conflict or revolution and stuff. I'm not going to get back into sort of what changed in the dynamics of the Georgia conflict, but certainly CIS has been given normative legitimacy by the international community before. The difference now is less about integrated spheres, and it's more about different spheres of authority and political influence. And that's what makes this so much more difficult. And especially in a country like Ukraine, when we're talking about, different associations and orientations going forward.
So just a few days ago, Tony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, expressed a very strong opinion about Russia's intervention in Kazakhstan, saying that oftentimes Russian forces go into countries, but it's very difficult for them to get out thereafter. The Russian Foreign Ministry took great exception to these comments. We're now in a situation only a few days later where it looks like there's an announcement that the CSTO peacekeeping forces are largely leaving. Was Tony Blinken wrong? Was this not an attempt on the part of Russia to use instability there as a pretext to invite itself into Kazakhstan for a long-term military presence?
I hope that he was wrong in a way that Russian diplomacy and Russian political leadership is not that primitive to just use a pretext and then that's it. So as we discussed earlier, it will be inevitable influence on relationship between Russia and Kazakhstan. But I don't believe that there is a need for Russia to grasp this rare opportunity to be there, because in the middle term and long term perspective, we will see a lot of things to happen in Kazakhstan, around Kazakhstan, and it's just, I'm afraid, just the beginning of this series of crises.
Alex, any thoughts?
I have nothing to add on that. Yeah.
Okay. Question from Stephen Haggart about the potential aftermath of this intervention. He said, Tokayev seemed to move quickly to have the CSTO forces withdraw. What is the domestic politics in Kazakhstan with respect to the Russian intervention? Is there a potential political cost? And let me expand this question a little bit more and talk about this question of ethnic relations inside Kazakhstan. There's a large Russian ethnic minority presence, particularly in the north of the country. My impression has been that over the years, relations between ethnic Kazakhs and ethnic Russians have been remarkably harmonious, and the potential for real enmity between them has been contained. Is this the sort of thing that could change that dynamic over time, or do you think that Kazakhstan can exhale, so to speak, on this question of ethnic relations inside the country?
And I think it's a great question. I haven't seen any polling yet on Kazakh attitudes towards the intervention. And so that will be interesting if we can get the first couple of rounds on that, and particularly just see some demographic breakdown, whether it varies by region or by generation, right? So the Soviet generation saying that's what Russia does. It brings order, it brings stability, versus the younger generation. But I get back again to the optics of long versus short, right? If this is sort of a decisive kind of intervention that apparently leaves Tokayev in charge, and the protests are quelled, there's not going to be much for the nationalists to hang their hats on yet. Now, can this grievance accumulate over the long term? Absolutely. But Kazakh nationalism tends to be oriented more against China, more against the West, a little bit against Russia, but not as virulent as some of the other kind of polls against. And just one reminder here, Kazakhstan has acted on behalf of, of its concerns about the North before. One of the things that caused some tension, some awkwardness between back then Astana and Moscow in the wake of Crimea was that Nazarbayev adopted a kind of a strict new anti-separatism law, right, where expressions of separatism, and it was understood as being in the North, were would be greeted with much greater sentences and prison time, especially. So yes, it's a concern, but again, if there's an efficacious authority, right, that emerges here, right? If the perception is that we have order and stability now, my best sense is that this isn't going to get the kind of legs that it would if it were much messier, or if there were optics of Russian troops beating protesters, firing. All of this has also been avoided, right? By sort of securing airports, telecommunication sites, and installations. You've avoided the resort to violence that could be captured on film.
So I'm not a big specialist on domestic situation in Kazakhstan, so just one observation. I think that this picture of pretty harmonious relationship between Russians and Kazakhs was partially, not entirely, partially product of a very skillful efforts by President Nazarbayev to create this picture of extremely successful contemporary state. As I heard from other many sources and from specialists, the tension was there, and this tension had a tendency to grow. And a recent period, maybe year or year and a half, the Russian concern, both policymakers and public opinion, Russian concern about the future of Russian-speaking people in Kazakhstan has been rising. And certainly, in case of continued destabilization, be it in fighting between clans or whatever, economic problems, this issue has unfortunately quite a significant potential to inflame. So that's why they need stabilization very urgently and very vitally, because each next level of these problems will multiply those problems which exist.
We have just a few more minutes left, and I want to turn to what has been going on between the United States and the West on the one hand and Russia on the other over Ukraine and the broader European security architecture. We had our first round of talks in Geneva yesterday between the Russian and American delegations. We have another meeting of the NATO-Russia Council, and then finally a meeting at OSCE to discuss all of this. What connection, if any, do you see between what has happened in Kazakhstan over the past week, the way it appears to be developing today, and this broader confrontation, if you will, between Russia and the West in Europe? Alex, you want to kick off?
Oh, I was hoping Fyodor would handle that one. Look,
you're welcome.
Yeah, I'm going to give a roundabout answer here, because I think we've moved in some significant ways, I think, that rebound on the network dynamics of this across the region than we were sort of 7 years ago, when the previous Ukraine crisis sprung up. And 7 years ago, there were two blocks, right? The kind of, the Russian-oriented bloc and the Western-oriented bloc. And it played out on almost every issue. Geoeconomic alignment, right? The root cause of the original Ukraine crisis, right? Whether to join the Eastern Partnership or the Eurasian Economic Union. It played out in terms of security orientation, right? NATO and the West, versus the Russian sphere. And it also played out with regards to rules and norms. Protests were viewed in that way, right? So anti-Yanukovych protests were necessarily pro-Western protests, right? It was a tug and war, zero sum. And any kind of political expression, I think, was understood in both sides that way. Some of the dynamics that we're talking about today have changed our understanding of political space. It's not so clear that Russia's gain is the West lost, the West, I mean, you know what I mean. That there is a true sense of change and set of sort of more complex political orientations, whether it has to do with Chinese and Turkish sort of entry and being informal partners to Russia in this part of the world, whether it's the disassociation with political protest from Western enthusiastic backing, right? And so this kind of high stakes, high intensity environment is not the case anymore, right? When we look at the context in which these talks are taking. The positive for this, maybe it means that there is more room for maneuver on behalf of the US to address some of the irreconcilable differences, as some commentators have put it, with regards to the kind of post-war security guarantees and new security architecture that Russia wants. But I think it lowers the stakes just a little bit in terms of the additional kind of political baggage that's going on. So I actually think it might enable a breakthrough as opposed to sort of hamper it, because not everything is reflexively my loss is your gain.
Fyodor?
Yeah, I'm really puzzled by what is happening in Geneva or happened in Geneva yesterday. Frankly, I'm less interested in what will happen in Brussels and Vienna, because I think the core discussion is on the bilateral level this time. It's not about anybody else to decide. I think that first of all, I very much agree with Alex about the completely changed landscape, geopolitical landscape. Kazakhstan demonstrated once again, and this might strengthen Russian willingness to be firm and tough. Demonstrated that on this territory, in the post-Soviet area, Russia is still the ultimate player, the player with most capacity to act and achieve what it wants. And that will strengthen Russian position, at least Russian self-perception. At the same time, it's very strange what is happening, because based on public statements we hear from both sides, but especially from the Russian side, there is no need to talk anymore, because there's unreconcilable differences. No way, that's it. But they intend to continue negotiations and find some ways to address those irreconcilable differences, which brings me to the idea that we don't know the whole picture. Maybe there is something else but just diplomatic talks. We don't know. If we put aside personalities and statements made, of course, we should understand that this is the most difficult and the most important talk since the German unification negotiations 1990. Because at that time, this current system of arrangements, security arrangements in Europe have been laid down. And now Russia is demanding to change it. And this is the profound difference, that in the United States, firstly, people used to interpret this talk as a talk about Ukraine. So in Russian case, it's not about Ukraine. Ukraine is a very important case, but it's just a case. It's a case of a big problem, which we have since the Cold War. And secondly, American side is ready to accept some, maybe even concessions or compromises when it comes to military technicalities. So to say, to be back to something like an arms control, conventional arms control talks as before, and maybe agree on something. So Russia wants to derail this framework to be back to the political discussion about principles of European security. And I assume that specific style, which we hear from Ryabkov and others, this is about this, not to allow this negotiation to come back to this technical discussion in the framework created after the Cold War. So whether it will be successful or not is another question. But again, the very fact that no one stops negotiation and declares it dead gives me some, not hope, but some food for thought.
Well, thank you. I think you've both provided us with abundant food for thought today on the situation in Kazakhstan and its broader implications for Central Asia and the greater relationship between the West and Russia. I want to thank both of our panelists for participating today. Thank you to our audience for some great questions. And I look forward to our next event at the Center for the National Interest. Thank you.
Thanks very much.